My ranch. It wasn't just land, it was my whole world. Sprawling across what felt like forever, it was a patchwork of green pastures, shady oak trees, and a winding creek that sang a gentle song as it flowed. I called it Havenwood, and it truly was my haven. I'd inherited Havenwood from my grandpa, a man who loved the land more than anything. He taught me how to ride a horse, how to mend a fence, and how to listen to the whispers of the wind through the tall grass. Every sunrise here felt like a blessing, every sunset a promise of peace. The size of Havenwood was important, not just for the grazing cattle that roamed freely, but for the space it gave me. Space to breathe, space to think, space to simply be. City life had always felt like being trapped in a tiny box, but here, under the vast Texas sky, I felt limitless. The old farmhouse, with its wide porch and creaky floors, was more than just a house, it was a living history book. Every nail, every board, had a story to tell. I spent my days tending to the land, raising my cattle, and enjoying the quiet solitude. Weekends were for fishing in the creek, grilling under the stars, and watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. The fence line, bordering a small development of newer houses, was a clear boundary between my world and theirs. It was an old, sturdy fence, built by my grandpa himself, marking the edge of Havenwood for decades. I never thought much about it, until she arrived. I never thought that fence would be a problem. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because Tuesdays were my usual supply run to town. As I drove back, I noticed a moving truck parked in front of the house closest to my fence line. New neighbors. I figured they'd be like the others, polite waves, maybe a friendly chat about the weather. I never imagined the storm that was brewing. The houses bordering my ranch were part of a small, meticulously planned community called Willow Creek Estates. It was one of those places where the lawns were always perfectly manicured, the houses all looked the same, and the HOA rules were thicker than a phone book. Not my cup of tea, but to each their own. A few days later, I saw her. She was standing in her front yard, arms crossed, surveying my fence with a look that could curdle milk. Her hair was perfectly styled, her clothes were crisp and new, and she had that air of someone who was used to getting her way. I knew right then, deep down, that this wasn't going to be a simple, welcome to the neighborhood, situation. Her name was Karen. Of course, it was. I tried to be neighborly. I waved as I drove past on my tractor, but she just glared. I even baked her a pie, apple, my grandpa's recipe, and left it on her doorstep. She never acknowledged it. I later saw the pie tin in her trash can. Karen seemed to spend her days meticulously inspecting every inch of her property, and, unfortunately, every inch of mine that she could see from her yard. I'd catch her staring at my cattle, at my tractor, at my slightly overgrown wildflowers. It was unnerving. One afternoon, as I was mending a section of the fence, she marched right over, her heels clicking on the pavement like an angry woodpecker. I knew this was it. The storm had arrived. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and demanding. "I need to talk to you about this eyesore." She gestured dramatically at my perfectly functional, grandpa-built fence. I braced myself. This was going to be interesting. "This fence," Karen began, her voice dripping with disdain, "is on my property. It needs to be moved. Immediately." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Excuse me?" I managed to stammer out. "This fence has been here for decades. It's well within my property line." Karen huffed, crossing her arms even tighter. "Don't give me that. I had my property surveyed. This fence is encroaching. I want it gone. Or moved. Whichever is easiest for you." "Surveyed?" I asked, skeptical. "When was this survey done?" "That's none of your concern," she snapped. "The point is, it's on my property, and I want it dealt with. I've already contacted the HOA, and they agree. It's a violation." "The HOA? Of course, she'd gone straight to the HOA. I could picture the perfectly manicured lawns and the identical mailboxes, all trembling in fear of Karen's wrath. I tried to remain calm. Look, I'm not sure what survey you're referring to, but I've never had any issues with the property line. This fence marks the boundary. It always has. Well, things change, Karen retorted, tapping her foot impatiently. And right now, things are changing. That fence needs to go. I want it removed within the week. Otherwise, I'll have to take further action. Further action? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. What kind of further action? Let's just say the HOA has ways of dealing with these things, she said with a smug smile. And I'm not afraid to use them. I sighed. This was escalating quickly. Karen, I'm not going to just tear down a perfectly good fence based on your say-so. I need to see some proof. Show me this survey you're talking about. I don't have to show you anything, she exclaimed. Just move the fence. I shook my head. Not happening. Not without proof. This is my property, and I'm not going to be bullied into doing something that's not right. Karen's face turned a shade of red that I hadn't thought possible. You'll regret this, she hissed. You'll regret the day you ever crossed me. And with that, she spun on her heel and marched back to her house, her heels clicking like a declaration of war. The fence dispute had officially begun. Karen's threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. I knew she wouldn't back down easily. But I also knew I was right. That fence had stood for generations, a silent testament to my family's claim on Havenwood. The next morning, a certified letter arrived from the Willow Creek Estates HOA. It was a formal notice, citing a violation of Section 3, Paragraph 12, Subsection B of the HOA agreement, something about unsightly boundary markers and encroachments on neighboring properties. It demanded the immediate removal of the fence, or face fines and potential legal action. I felt a surge of anger, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to let Karen bully me. I decided to fight back, but to do it the right way. I drafted a polite but firm letter to the HOA, explaining the situation. I pointed out that the fence had been in place long before Willow Creek Estates was even a twinkle in a developer's eye. I also mentioned that, to my knowledge, previous surveys of the property confirmed the fence's location within my boundaries. I even attached copies of old property records, showing the historical fence line. I emphasized my willingness to cooperate and find a reasonable solution, but I also made it clear that I wouldn't be intimidated into removing a fence that rightfully belonged on my property. I hand-delivered the letter to the HOA president, a mild-mannered man named Mr. Henderson, hoping he would see reason. Mr. Henderson seemed sympathetic, but he also seemed terrified of Karen. He mumbled something about keeping the peace and following the rules. He promised to review the documents, but I could tell he was already leaning towards Karen's side. Later that week, I received a follow-up letter from the HOA, politely acknowledging my response but ultimately siding with Karen. They reiterated their demand for the fence's removal, citing the need to maintain property values and ensure harmonious living within the community. It was clear that reason wasn't going to work here. Karen had them in her clutches. I needed a new strategy. The HOA's decision emboldened Karen. The trickle of harassment turned into a flood. It started with daily emails, filled with legal jargon and thinly veiled threats. She CC'd the entire HOA board on every message, turning my inbox into a battlefield. Then came the letters. Official-looking documents, typed in all caps and signed with a flourish, detailing the severe violations I was committing and the dire consequences I would face if I didn't comply. She even included printed-out satellite images of my ranch, with the fence circled in red marker. It was creepy. She began complaining about everything. That noise from my cattle, they mooed, the dust from my tractor, it's a ranch, and the unsightly weeds that grew along the fence line, they were wildflowers. It was clear she was trying to make my life as miserable as possible. The HOA, under Karen's relentless pressure, started sending inspectors to my property. They'd nitpick every little thing, finding minor infractions, and issuing warning notices. My mailbox was overflowing with official complaints. I felt like I was living under siege. One morning, I woke up to find bright pink flags planted all along the fence line, marking what I assumed was the correct property line according to Karen's mysterious survey. It was a blatant act of aggression, a clear attempt to provoke me. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my work, but it was impossible. Karen was everywhere, a constant presence in my life, a thorn in my side. She had turned my peaceful ranch into a battleground. The final straw came when she started leaving anonymous notes on my doorstep, filled with insults and personal attacks. That's when I knew I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to do something, and I needed to do it fast. I wasn't going to let Karen drive me off my own land. It was time to fight back, but this time, I was going to play her game. It was time to consult a professional. The next day, I drove into town to see a lawyer. Her name was Ms. Evans, and she specialized in property disputes. Her office was small but efficient, filled with stacks of legal documents and a calming scent of lemon polish. I laid out the whole story, from the initial confrontation with Karen to the relentless harassment from the HOA. I showed her the letters, the emails, the HOA notices, and even the anonymous notes. Ms. Evans listened patiently, her expression growing increasingly grim. "This is a clear case of harassment," she said, after reviewing the documents. "And the HOA's actions are questionable, at best. They seem to be bending over backwards to appease Ms. Karen." I asked her about my property rights, about the fence, about Karen's mysterious survey. Ms. Evans assured me that, based on the available evidence, I had a strong case. The historical records and previous surveys all pointed to the fence being within my property line. However, she cautioned, we need to be absolutely certain. "I recommend we commission a new, independent survey of your property. That will give us definitive proof, one way or the other." I agreed. A new survey was expensive, but it was worth it for the peace of mind, and for the legal ammunition it would provide. Ms. Evans also suggested sending a cease and desist letter to Karen, demanding that she stop the harassment immediately. "We need to put her on notice," Ms. Evans explained. "Let her know that her actions are illegal and that we're prepared to take legal action if she doesn't stop." I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Finally, I had someone on my side, someone who understood the law and knew how to fight back. I authorized Ms. Evans to send the cease and desist letter and scheduled the new property survey. It was time to take the offensive. It was time to protect Havenwood. For my grandpa, for myself, and for the future. I wasn't going to let Karen win. A week later, the surveyors arrived. They were a team of 3, armed with tripods, laser levels, and a bewildering array of high-tech equipment. They spent the entire day meticulously mapping the property, taking measurements, and marking boundaries. Karen watched them from her window, her face a mask of fury. I could almost see the steam coming out of her ears. The cease and desist letter from Ms. Evans had clearly not deterred her. If anything, it seemed to have made her even angrier. Finally, after hours of work, the surveyors packed up their equipment and handed me a preliminary report. The final, official document would be delivered to Ms. Evans, but the lead surveyor gave me the gist of it. "Well, Mr. Narrator's last name," he said with a smile, "it looks like your fence is exactly where you say it is. In fact, it's well within your property line. Ms. Karen's understanding of the boundary seems to be a bit off." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I knew it. I had been right all along. The fence was on my property, and now I had definitive proof. I couldn't wait to see the look on Karen's face when she found out. The official survey arrived a few days later, confirming the preliminary findings. It was a detailed document, complete with maps, measurements, and legal descriptions, irrefutably proving that the fence was entirely within Havenwood's property line. Ms. Evans immediately sent a copy of the survey to Karen and the HOA, along with a sternly worded letter demanding that they cease and desist all further harassment. She also threatened to file a lawsuit if they didn't comply. I allowed myself a small moment of celebration. I had won the first battle. But I knew the war wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't one to give up easily. I had a feeling she was just getting started. And that's when I started thinking about how I could take the fight to her. After all, turnabout is fair play. I had hoped the survey and the cease and desist letter would put an end to Karen's antics. I was wrong. So very wrong. The next morning, I found a copy of the survey taped to my front door, with the words, "Fake News," scrawled across it in bright red lipstick. The emails started again, even more furious and unhinged than before. She accused me of bribing the surveyors, of forging the documents, of conspiring with the government to steal her land. She even claimed that my cattle were spreading disease and polluting the environment. The HOA, surprisingly, seemed to back off, at least for a little while. Mr. Henderson called me, sounding flustered and apologetic. He said they were reviewing the situation and would get back to me soon. I suspected Karen was still working on them behind the scenes, but for now, at least, the official harassment had subsided. But Karen herself was undeterred. She started parking her car at the edge of her property, facing my ranch, with her headlights shining directly into my bedroom window at night. I had to hang thick blankets to block out the glare. She also began playing loud music at all hours of the day and night, a bizarre mix of opera and heavy metal. It was clearly designed to annoy me, and it was working. I could hear the thumping bass even through the closed windows of my farmhouse. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my work, but it was impossible. Karen was like a persistent mosquito, buzzing around my head, driving me crazy. I knew I couldn't let her win. I needed to find a way to stop her, once and for all. And that's when the idea came to me. A way to turn the tables, to use her own tactics against her. A way to finally reclaim my peace and quiet. It was a risky plan, but I was desperate. And I knew, deep down, that it was the only way to deal with a Karen. My plan was simple, but audacious. I was going to fight fire with fire. I was going to use Karen's own weapon, the property line, against her. I remembered something my grandpa used to say, "Always know your boundaries, son. And always know where your neighbors end." He wasn't just talking about fences, he was talking about knowing your rights, knowing the law, and knowing how to protect what's yours. I spent the next few days poring over the new survey, studying every line, every measurement, every legal description. I was looking for something, anything, that I could use to my advantage. And then I found it. Tucked away in a corner of the survey, almost hidden in the fine print, was a small detail about an easement, a legal right allowing someone to use another person's land for a specific purpose. In this case, there was a tiny sliver of Karen's property that technically encroached on my land, due to an old utility easement that had never been properly adjusted when Willow Creek Estates was built. It was a minuscule piece of land, no bigger than a small garden plot. But it was enough. It was my loophole. It was my chance to turn the tables on Karen. I immediately called Ms. Evans and explained my plan. She was hesitant at first, warning me about the potential legal ramifications. But I convinced her that it was worth a shot. After all, Karen had been harassing me for months, and the HOA had turned a blind eye. It was time to take matters into my own hands. Ms. Evans agreed to research the easement and determine the legal steps required to claim the land. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was determined. I was going to take that little piece of Karen's property, and I was going to use it to teach her a lesson about respecting boundaries. It was time for Karen to experience what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a property dispute. It was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. It was time for Havenwood to have its revenge. The encroaching portion of Karen's land was almost comical in its insignificance. It was a small, triangular patch that jutted out into my property like an unwelcome guest. You'd barely notice it unless you were specifically looking for it. It was located near the back of her yard, bordering a thicket of trees and shrubs. It wasn't like she was using the land for anything important. It wasn't part of her meticulously manicured lawn, or her prize-winning rose garden. It was just, there. A neglected corner of her property that happened to technically belong to me, thanks to a quirk of property law and a forgotten easement. The easement itself dated back to the original construction of the Willow Creek Estates development. Apparently, a utility company had needed to run an underground cable across a portion of my ranch to service the new homes. The easement granted them the right to do so, but it also created a minor discrepancy in the property lines. When the development was completed, the easement was supposed to have been adjusted, but for some reason, it never was. And now, years later, that oversight was about to become Karen's worst nightmare. I visited the area myself, armed with the survey and a measuring tape. I carefully marked the boundaries of the encroaching land, using small wooden stakes and bright orange string. It was even smaller than I had imagined, but it was enough to make a statement. I could just picture Karen's reaction when she discovered what I was planning. I imagined her face turning red, her eyes bulging, her voice rising to a screech. It was a delicious thought. The next step was to make it official. To formally stake my claim to the land and notify Karen of my intentions. It was time to set the wheels in motion. It was time to unleash Havenwood's revenge. I just needed to be patient, and let Ms. Evans work her legal magic. The wait was going to be difficult, but I knew the payoff would be worth it. After all, a little bit of land can be a powerful weapon in the right hands. Especially when dealing with a Karen. Ms. Evans sprang into action. She researched the easement, contacted the utility company, and navigated the labyrinthine world of property law. It was a slow and tedious process, filled with paperwork, legal jargon, and bureaucratic red tape. She discovered that the easement was indeed still in effect, and that the utility company had no objection to relinquishing their claim on the small piece of land. This cleared the way for me to pursue a quiet title action, a legal proceeding to establish clear ownership of the property. The first step was to send Karen a formal notice, informing her of my intent to claim the land and giving her an opportunity to contest my claim. Ms. Evans drafted the letter, making sure it was airtight and legally sound. The letter was delivered by certified mail, return receipt requested. I imagined Karen's reaction as she opened it, her face contorting with rage and disbelief. It was the moment of truth. Weeks turned into months as Ms. Evans meticulously prepared the legal documents and filed them with the court. There were hearings to attend, affidavits to sign, and legal arguments to be made. It was a complex and time-consuming process, but Ms. Evans was a skilled and experienced lawyer, and she handled everything with professionalism and expertise. During this time, Karen's harassment continued, albeit at a slightly reduced intensity. She still played her loud music, still parked her car with the headlights shining into my window, and still sent me occasional angry emails. But I was no longer as bothered by it. I knew that I was one step closer to reclaiming my peace and quiet, and that gave me the strength to endure. Finally, after months of legal wrangling, the court issued a ruling in my favor. I had successfully established clear ownership of the small piece of Karen's property. It was official. I was now the proud owner of a tiny, triangular patch of land that jutted out into Havenwood like an unwelcome guest. It was time to inform Karen of my victory, and to watch the fireworks begin. The plan was complete. It was time for action. The moment had arrived. I asked Ms. Evans to draft a formal letter to Karen, informing her of the court's decision and politely requesting that she respect the new property line. But I didn't just want to send a letter. I wanted to make a statement. So, I decided to personally deliver the news, along with a little, something, extra. I loaded up my tractor with a few fence posts, some wire, and a roll of bright orange construction tape. Then, I drove it slowly and deliberately towards the edge of my property, right up to the boundary of the disputed land. Karen, predictably, came storming out of her house. Her face was red, her eyes were bulging, and her hair looked like she had just stuck her finger in a light socket. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, her voice echoing across the manicured lawns of Willow Creek Estates. I cut the engine of the tractor and hopped down, wearing my widest, most innocent smile. "Just marking my property line, Karen," I said calmly, as if I were discussing the weather. "That's my property," she sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at the small patch of land. "Not anymore, Karen," I said, handing her a copy of the court order. "The court ruled in my favor. This land now belongs to Havenwood." Her face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions: disbelief, anger, confusion, and finally, pure, unadulterated rage. "This is ridiculous," she screamed. "This is outrageous. I'm going to sue. I'm going to call the HOA. I'm going to." "You're going to respect my property line, Karen," I interrupted, planting the first fence post firmly into the ground. "Just like I've always respected yours." I continued to work, methodically erecting a small, temporary fence around the disputed land, using the orange construction tape to clearly mark the boundary. It was a small gesture, but it sent a powerful message. The tables had turned. The hunter had become the hunted. And Karen was about to learn what it felt like to be on the losing end of a property dispute. It was time for Havenwood to claim its due. It was time for Karen to face the music. It was time for a little bit of payback. Karen's reaction was everything I had hoped for, and more. She stomped her feet, she waved her arms, she screamed at the top of her lungs. She threatened to call the police, the HOA, the governor, and even the President of the United States. "This is an outrage," she shrieked, her voice cracking with fury. "I'm going to sue you. I'm going to make your life a living hell." I simply smiled and continued working, planting the fence posts and stringing the orange tape. I knew I had her beat. I had the court order, I had the legal documentation, and I had the moral high ground. Karen was powerless to stop me. She tried a different tactic. She started pleading, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "Please, narrator's name, don't do this. It's just a tiny piece of land. It doesn't mean anything to you." "It means everything to me, Karen," I said, without looking up from my work. "It means you're finally learning what it feels like to have your property rights violated." She then tried to physically interfere, attempting to pull up the fence posts and tear down the construction tape. But I stood my ground, calmly but firmly preventing her from doing so. I wasn't going to let her provoke me into violence. I was going to win this battle with legal means, not with fists. Eventually, she realized that her efforts were futile. She threw her hands up in the air in defeat and stormed back to her house, muttering threats and curses under her breath. I finished erecting the temporary fence, marking the boundaries of my newly acquired land. It was a small victory, but it was a sweet one. I had finally stood up to Karen and won. I had defended Havenwood and reclaimed my peace of mind. As I drove my tractor back to the farmhouse, I could see Karen standing on her porch, staring at me with a look of pure hatred. I knew that this wasn't the end of the story. Karen wasn't one to give up easily. But I was ready for her. I had all the legal documentation in order, and I had a plan for whatever she might try next. Havenwood was safe, for now. But the war was far from over. True to form, Karen immediately ran to the HOA. I received a flurry of emails from Mr. Henderson, the HOA president, sounding even more flustered and apologetic than usual. He requested a meeting, a peace summit, as he called it, to discuss the unfortunate situation and find a mutually agreeable solution. I agreed, but I made it clear that I wouldn't be budging on the property line. The meeting was held in the Willow Creek Estates Community Clubhouse, a sterile and impersonal room with beige walls and uncomfortable chairs. Karen was there, of course, looking like she was about to explode. Mr. Henderson and 2 other HOA board members were also present, looking nervous and uncomfortable. Karen launched into a tirade, accusing me of all sorts of things, violating HOA rules, devaluing property values, and being a general nuisance to the community. She demanded that the HOA force me to remove the fence and return the land to her. I calmly presented my case, showing them the court order and explaining the legal basis for my actions. I emphasized that I was simply exercising my property rights, and that I had followed all the proper legal procedures. The HOA board members listened attentively, but I could tell they were torn. They didn't want to anger Karen, but they also couldn't ignore the fact that I had a valid court order. Finally, after much deliberation, Mr. Henderson spoke. "Ms. Karen," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "we understand your frustration, but after reviewing the legal documents, it's clear that Mr. Narrator's last name is acting within his rights. The HOA has no authority to interfere in a private property dispute that has been decided by a court of law." Karen's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. She sputtered and protested, but the HOA board members were unmoved. They had finally realized that they couldn't bend the rules to appease Karen's whims. The HOA's refusal to intervene was a major victory. It meant that Karen was on her own. She couldn't use the HOA as a weapon against me anymore. It was just her and me, facing off across the property line. And I was ready for whatever she might try next. The HOA Karen had failed to rally the HOA. The next step was to start planting. Now that the land was legally mine, it was time to put it to good use. I decided against anything too extravagant. I didn't want to rub salt in Karen's wounds unnecessarily, okay, maybe just a little. I went to the local nursery and bought a selection of wildflowers, the same kind that Karen had complained about growing along the fence line. I figured it would be a fitting tribute to her sensitivity. I spent the afternoon tilling the small patch of land, preparing the soil for planting. Karen watched me from her window, her face a mask of simmering rage. I could feel her eyes burning a hole in the back of my head, but I didn't let it bother me. I was finally in control, and it felt glorious. Once the soil was ready, I carefully planted the wildflower seeds, scattering them evenly across the small plot. I watered them gently, whispering a silent promise to them to grow tall and beautiful, and to annoy Karen to no end. As I was finishing up, I noticed Karen marching towards me, her heels clicking angrily on the pavement. I braced myself for another confrontation. "What do you think you're doing now?" she demanded, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Planting weeds? Trying to ruin my property values?" "Just beautifying my land, Karen," I said with a smile. "Adding a little touch of nature." "Those are weeds," she shrieked. "They're going to spread everywhere. They're going to ruin my lawn." "I'm sure you'll find a way to cope, Karen," I said, turning to leave. "After all, you're so good at controlling everything." I walked back to my tractor, leaving Karen fuming in the distance. As I drove away, I couldn't help but laugh. It was such a small thing, planting a few wildflowers. But it was a symbol of my victory, a testament to my resilience, and a constant reminder to Karen that she couldn't bully me anymore. And as the wildflowers bloomed, so would my peace of mind. The seeds of discontent had been sown, and it was time to let them grow. Next, I would add something a little more permanent. Karen's desperation was palpable. She tried everything she could think of to get the land back, but nothing worked. First, she tried pleading. She came to my door, tears streaming down her face, begging me to reconsider. She offered me money, a new car, even a lifetime supply of her famous apple pie, the same recipe I had gifted her, which she threw away. "Please, narrator's name," she sobbed. "This land means everything to me. It's part of my property. It's part of my identity." I remained unmoved. "You should have thought about that before you started harassing me, Karen," I said coldly. Then, she tried threats. She sent me anonymous letters, warning me that bad things would happen if I didn't return the land. She even vandalized my mailbox, spray painting the words, "land thief," across it in bright red paint. I simply shrugged it off and installed a security camera. I wasn't going to be intimidated. I had all the legal documentation in order, and I knew that Karen was just grasping at straws. She tried to appeal to the HOA again, but they refused to get involved. They had learned their lesson. They weren't going to risk getting sued by interfering in a private property dispute. She even tried to hire a lawyer, but no reputable attorney would take her case. They all knew that she was fighting a losing battle. As the wildflowers began to bloom, Karen's desperation grew. She became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. She would stand at the edge of her property for hours, staring at my wildflowers with a look of pure hatred. I knew that she was on the verge of a complete meltdown. And frankly, I was enjoying every minute of it. She had made my life miserable for months, and now it was her turn to suffer. I decided it was time to add something a little more permanent to the land, something that would really drive her over the edge. I went to the local hardware store and bought a small garden gnome. It was bright pink, slightly tacky, and utterly ridiculous. It was perfect. The chaos gnome was ready to be deployed. The morning I placed the bright pink garden gnome on the contested land, I noticed something unusual. A few of the other neighbors in Willow Creek Estates were watching me from their windows, not with the usual curiosity or annoyance, but with something approaching amusement. As the days passed, I began to notice more subtle signs of support. A friendly wave from a neighbor I had never spoken to before. A plate of cookies left anonymously on my doorstep. Even a few whispered words of encouragement as I drove my tractor through the community. It turned out that Karen's behavior had alienated many of her neighbors. They were tired of her constant complaining, her endless demands, and her general sense of entitlement. They had seen how she had harassed me, and they were starting to sympathize with my situation. Some of them had even witnessed Karen's more outrageous antics, her screaming matches, her vandalism, her late-night headlight displays. They knew that she was out of control, and they were starting to fear that she would turn her attention to them next. A few of the bolder neighbors even started to actively support me. They would offer to help me with my chores, bring me coffee in the morning, and even stand guard while I was working on the contested land, making sure that Karen didn't try anything drastic. One afternoon, Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman who lived across the street from Karen, approached me with a mischievous twinkle in her eye. "I just wanted to let you know that I think you're doing a wonderful thing," she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Someone had to stand up to that woman. She's been running roughshod over this community for too long. The community backlash against Karen was a welcome surprise. It gave me a sense of validation and support that I hadn't expected. It also made me realize that I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore, I was fighting for everyone who had ever been bullied or intimidated by a Karen. And that gave me even more motivation to see this through to the end. The gnome was now a symbol of community resistance. And it was glorious. It didn't happen overnight, but slowly, gradually, Karen's resistance began to crumble. The constant legal battles, the lack of support from the HOA, the growing animosity from her neighbors, it all took its toll. The once impeccably dressed and perfectly coiffed Karen started to look disheveled and worn. The angry emails became less frequent, and the loud music eventually stopped altogether. She stopped tending to her lawn, and the prize-winning roses began to wither. The perfectly manicured facade of her life began to crack, revealing the desperation and unhappiness beneath. One morning, I saw her sitting on her porch, staring blankly at the wildflowers and the bright pink garden gnome. She looked defeated, broken, and utterly alone. A few days later, I found a small, handwritten note taped to my front door. It simply said, "I give up. You win." I didn't gloat or celebrate. I simply nodded to myself and went back to tending to my ranch. I had proven my point. I had defended Havenwood. And I had finally reclaimed my peace of mind. Karen never apologized, and she never admitted that she was wrong. But she did stop harassing me. She stopped complaining about my property, she stopped trying to control my life, and she finally started respecting my boundaries. She still lived in the house next door, but she was no longer a threat. She was just, there. A sad, lonely figure in a perfectly manicured community. I occasionally saw her tending to her garden, or walking her dog through the neighborhood. She would always avoid eye contact, and she never spoke to me again. But I didn't hold a grudge. I had gotten what I wanted. I had taught her a lesson about respect and boundaries. And I had finally restored peace to Havenwood. It was a hard-won victory, but it was worth it. The fight was over. Karen had been defeated. Now, what to do with that gnome? It was time to consider the fence again. The old fence, the one that had started this whole mess, was still standing. It was a sturdy fence, built by my grandpa, but it was also old and weathered. It served its purpose, but it wasn't exactly a thing of beauty. Now that the property line was definitively settled, and Karen was no longer a threat, I started thinking about replacing it. I could have just left it as it was, a constant reminder of my victory. But I decided to take a different approach. I contacted a local fencing company and ordered a brand new fence, a nicer one, made of cedar wood and wrought iron. It was a beautiful fence, one that would enhance the look of both my ranch and Karen's property, whether she liked it or not. I could have built the new fence myself, but I decided to hire professionals. I didn't want to give Karen any reason to complain, and I also didn't want to risk any further conflict. The fencing company arrived a few days later and began the work. They tore down the old fence and started erecting the new one, following the actual property line, as determined by the survey. I made sure to be extra polite and considerate during the construction, keeping the noise to a minimum and cleaning up any mess. I even offered the workers cold drinks and snacks. Karen watched the construction from her window, her face unreadable. I couldn't tell if she was angry, sad, or simply indifferent. When the new fence was finished, it was a thing of beauty. It was a clean, elegant boundary that clearly marked the property line, without being intrusive or offensive. It was a symbol of peace and reconciliation, a testament to the fact that even the most bitter disputes can be resolved with respect and understanding. I even considered offering Karen a small discount on the fence, as a gesture of goodwill. But then I decided against it. I didn't want her to think that I was trying to buy her forgiveness. Instead, I simply left her a note on her doorstep, thanking her for her cooperation, even though she hadn't been very cooperative, and wishing her all the best. The new fence was the final act in this long and complicated drama. It was a symbol of closure, a sign that the war was finally over, and that peace had finally returned to Havenwood. And as for the pink garden gnome, it found a new home, guarding my tomato plants. It was perfect. The HOA Karen was gone, but the memories would remain. With the new fence in place, and Karen finally subdued, life on Havenwood returned to normal. The sunrises seemed brighter, the sunsets more peaceful, and the wind whispered gentler songs through the tall grass. I spent my days tending to my cattle, mending fences, the ones not bordering Karen's property, and enjoying the quiet solitude of my ranch. Weekends were once again for fishing in the creek, grilling under the stars, and watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. The bright pink garden gnome, now a beloved member of the Havenwood family, stood guard over my tomato plants, a constant reminder of the battle I had fought and won. I occasionally saw Karen, but she was no longer a source of stress or anxiety. She was just a neighbor, a reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right, and of the power of a well-placed boundary. The community of Willow Creek Estates, initially wary of my rural lifestyle, had come to respect me, and even appreciate the peace and quiet that Havenwood brought to their meticulously planned community. Mr. Henderson, the HOA president, even stopped by one day to apologize for the HOA's initial involvement in the dispute. He admitted that they had been swayed by Karen's forceful personality, and that they had learned a valuable lesson about fairness and due process. Life on Havenwood was good. I had successfully defended my property, taught Karen a lesson about respect and boundaries, and restored peace to my little corner of the world. My grandpa would have been proud. He had taught me how to love the land, how to protect what's mine, and how to stand up to bullies. And I had done just that. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky with brilliant colors, I realized that the fight with Karen had actually made me appreciate Havenwood even more. It had reminded me of the importance of family, of tradition, and of the simple joys of life on the ranch. The HOA Karen was gone, but the lessons she had taught me would stay with me forever. And as I looked out over my peaceful ranch, I knew that I was finally home. The peace had been restored. The end.